Sister Rosetta Tharpe sat in the back of a small London club in March 1968, watching a young man with an Afro tune, a white Stratocaster under dim stage lights. She'd been told his name 3 times that evening. Jimi Hendrix. The third person who said it added, "You have to see him. He's doing things nobody's ever done." Rosetta smiled politely and said nothing. She'd heard that before. It was a Tuesday night, unseasonably cold for March, and the club was half empty. Maybe 40 people scattered across tables, most of them musicians themselves. The kind of crowd that shows up on off nights hoping to catch something real. Rosetta had come with a friend, a British jazz pianist she'd met during her first UK tour back in 1957. He'd insisted, "Rose, you need to see this kid. He's from America. Plays like nothing I've ever heard." She'd agreed mostly to be polite. She was 52 years old and had been playing guitar for 40 years. She'd seen everything. The 1930s felt both distant and immediate to her. She could still remember the weight of that first electric guitar, a Gibson ES 150, heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. She was 23 years old, standing in a church in Brooklyn, about to plug into an amplifier for the first time during a gospel service. The congregation didn't know what was coming. Neither did she. When she hit the first chord, the sound that came out was so loud, so clear, so unlike anything anyone had heard in a church before, that people literally jumped in their pews. Some covered their ears. Others stared with their mouths open. The preacher looked concerned. But Rosetta kept playing. She played Rock Me with that electric guitar, and the sound filled the entire church, vibrated through the walls, made the wooden floors hum. People started clapping, then they started dancing. By the end of the song, the whole congregation was on their feet, and Rosetta knew she'd found something. That was 1938. She'd been the first, or one of the first, to take the electric guitar out of the jazz clubs and into sacred music, to show that volume and spirit weren't opposites, that electricity could carry the gospel just as well as any acoustic instrument. Maybe better. For the next 3 decades, she'd played that guitar all over America, then Europe, recording songs that mixed gospel, blues, and roll before rock and roll had a name. She'd influenced everyone who came after, though most people didn't know it. The credit went to men. It usually did. Now she sat in this London club, cold air seeping through the walls, watching this young guitarist check his tuning with the kind of concentration she recognized. The way he touched the strings, delicate but certain, reminded her of something. She couldn't place it yet. The club smelled like cigarettes and spilled beer. The stage was barely raised, maybe 6 inches off the floor, with 2 small amplifiers and a drum kit pushed into the corner. No one had announced Jimmy. He'd just walked on stage a few minutes earlier, plugged in, and started adjusting things. Most of the audience was still talking, not paying attention. They didn't know yet. Rosetta's friend leaned over and said, "He played the Saville Theater last week. Pete Townshend was there. Said it changed his understanding of the instrument." Rosetta nodded but didn't respond. She was watching Jimmy's hands. The way he held the guitar was unusual, upside down because he was left-handed playing a right-handed Strat restrung backwards. She'd seen left-handed players before, but something about his posture, the angle of his wrist, suggested he'd taught himself, figured it out alone without anyone showing him the correct way. That interested her. He finished tuning and looked up at the audience for the first time. His expression was neutral, almost shy. He didn't introduce himself, didn't say what he was going to play. Just started. The first note stopped every conversation in the room. It wasn't loud at first, it was the tone. Clean but somehow already bending, already speaking before it had fully formed. Then he hit the second note and Rosetta felt something shift in her chest. She knew that sound. Not the exact sound, but the intention behind it. The way you could make an electric guitar sing if you understood it wasn't just an instrument, but a voice. Something with its own language that you had to learn to speak. He played a blues progression, simple at first, just establishing the key, letting people settle into it. But his touch on the strings was unlike anything Rosetta had heard. He wasn't playing notes. He was bending them, stretching them, making them cry and moan and whisper. Every string bend had purpose. Every moment of feedback was controlled, shaped, turned into melody instead of noise. She watched his fingers move across the fretboard and saw her own fingers 30 years earlier, finding those same spaces between the notes, those same moments where the guitar stopped being wood and wire and became something else. Then he started singing. His voice was soft, almost conversational, floating over the guitar like he was telling a story to one person instead of a room. The song was Red House, a slow blues about lost love, simple in structure but infinite in feeling. Rosetta knew blues. She'd grown up with blues. She'd played with Muddy Waters, with Big Bill Brunzi, with everyone who mattered in that world. But this was different. This was blues filtered through something new, something she hadn't quite heard before. When he hit the first solo, Rosetta's hands gripped the edge of the table. He wasn't showing off. He was exploring, finding sounds inside sounds, pulling emotions out of the guitar that she didn't know were possible. The way he used the tremolo bar, bending entire chords at once, creating waves of sound that rose and fell like breathing. The way he played behind his back, not as a trick, but as a natural extension of his movement, his body and the guitar becoming one thing. The way he made feedback sound beautiful, almost orchestral, layering it with melody until you couldn't tell where the music ended and the noise began. She'd spent 40 years playing electric guitar. She'd invented techniques that other people later claimed as their own. She'd shown a generation of musicians that the electric guitar could be a lead instrument, could carry a melody, could be powerful and precise at the same time. And now she was watching someone take everything she'd started and push it somewhere she hadn't imagined. Her friend whispered, "What do you think?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on Jimmy's hands, watching them dance across the strings with a speed and fluidity that seemed impossible. But it wasn't the speed that got her, it was the intention. Every note meant something. Every bend told a story. He wasn't playing fast to impress anyone. He was playing fast because that's how the story needed to be told. The song built slowly, Jimmy adding layers, creating a conversation between his voice and his guitar, between rhythm and lead, between the past and whatever was coming next. Rosetta recognized fragments of things she'd played, ideas she'd explored, techniques she'd pioneered. But he'd taken them further. He'd taken the seed she'd planted in 1938 and grown it into something she couldn't have predicted. She looked down at her own hands resting on the table. These hands had played Carnegie Hall. These hands had recorded dozens of albums. These hands had taught Sister Rosetta Tharpe how to make an electric guitar sound like the voice of God in a gospel service. But watching Jimmy play, she understood something she'd never quite articulated before. She'd started something. She'd opened a door. And now she was watching someone walk through it into rooms she'd never seen. The solo peaked, Jimmy bending a note so high it seemed like it would break, holding it there, sustaining it with controlled feedback until the whole room was vibrating with that one note. Then he brought it down slowly, gently, like lowering someone to the ground after lifting them to the sky. The transition back to the vocal verse was seamless, the guitar dropping into a supportive role, letting the story continue. Rosetta felt something wet on her cheek and realized she was crying. Not sad tears. Something else. Something more complex. Pride, maybe. Or recognition. Or the strange feeling of seeing your own legacy standing in front of you, transformed into something bigger than you'd imagined it could be. When the song ended, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the room erupted. People were standing, applauding, shouting. Jimmy smiled slightly, nodded, unplugged his guitar, and walked off stage like he'd just finished a practice session. No encore, no speech, just the music, and then nothing. Rosetta sat still while the club slowly returned to normal noise. People talking excitedly about what they'd just witnessed, musicians comparing notes, trying to figure out how he'd done what he'd done. Her friend turned to her and asked again, "Well, what did you think?" She opened her mouth to respond and found she had no words. How do you explain watching someone complete a sentence you started 40 years ago? How do you describe the feeling of seeing your innovation become someone else's foundation? Your revolution becomes someone else's starting point? After a long pause, she said quietly, "He knows." "Knows what?" her friend asked. "What it's for," she said. "The electricity, the volume, the noise. He knows what it's for. Her friend looked confused, but Rosetta didn't elaborate. She couldn't explain that in 1938, when she first plugged in that Gibson, she'd been trying to find a way to make the guitar loud enough to compete with a full band, to cut through the sound of drums and piano and make the melody heard. But it had always been more than volume. It had been about expressing something that acoustic couldn't express, about using technology to amplify not just sound but feeling, emotion, spirit. Most people who came after her used electricity for power or showmanship. Jimi used it the way she'd intended, as a language. They left the club 20 minutes later. The cold air hit Rosetta's face, and she pulled her coat tighter. The streets of London were quiet, just a few cars passing, streetlights casting yellow pools on wet pavement. As they walked toward the main road to find a taxi, her friend tried to make conversation, but Rosetta was somewhere else, still hearing that guitar, still seeing those hands. At one point, he asked, "Do you want to meet him? I could arrange it. I know his manager." Rosetta shook her head. "No, that was enough." "Are you sure? I think he'd be honored. People say he grew up listening to blues and gospel records. Probably heard your music." "I'm sure he did," Rosetta said. "That's why I don't need to meet him. He already said everything that needed to be said." They rode back to her hotel in silence. Rosetta stared out the taxi window at London passing by, thinking about churches and amplifiers, about 1938 and 1968, about the distance between planting a seed and seeing the tree fully grown. In her hotel room, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the light. Her guitar case was leaning against the wall in the corner. She looked at it and thought about opening it, about playing something, about trying to process what she'd witnessed through her own hands. But she didn't move. Some moments weren't meant to be processed. They were meant to be felt. She thought about all the young white guitarists who'd claimed they invented rock and roll, who'd taken the blues and gospel she'd played and stripped the credit from the source. She thought about how many times she'd been introduced as a gospel singer when she was really a guitarist who happened to sing. She thought about the years of being dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, because she was a woman, because she was black, because she played in churches instead of concert halls. And then she thought about Jimi on that small stage, doing everything she'd done and more, taking it further, higher, deeper. And she felt something unexpected. Not bitterness, not resentment, something closer to completion. 3 years later, in 1971, Rosetta was doing an interview for a European music magazine. The journalist was young, barely 25, and clearly didn't know much about her career beyond the basic facts. Near the end of the interview, he asked casually, "What do you think of modern rock guitarists? Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, those guys?" Rosetta was quiet for a moment, remembering that night in the London club. Then she smiled and said, "Jimi Hendrix understood." "Understood what?" the journalist asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "I saw him play once. Small club in London. He didn't know I was there." She paused, her fingers unconsciously forming chord shapes on the arm of her chair. "When I started playing electric guitar in the 30s, people thought I was crazy. They said it was too loud, too worldly, not appropriate for gospel music. But I knew the sound was right. I knew electricity could carry the spirit just as well as anything else. Maybe better." "And Hendrix?" "He knew the same thing Rosetta said. "He knew the guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was a way to speak when words weren't enough." That's what I heard that night. Someone speaking the same language I'd been speaking for 40 years, but with an accent I'd never heard before. She smiled again, softer this time. It was like hearing your own voice coming back to you from the future. The journalist wrote down her words but didn't seem to understand their weight. He moved on to the next question, something about touring schedules. Rosetta answered mechanically, her mind still in that London club, still watching those hands, still feeling that sound. She died 2 years later, in 1973, before Jimi's influence had fully crystallized into legend, before music historians started drawing the line from her to him, before her name was properly restored to the story of rock and roll's creation. But on that night in March 1968, sitting in the back of a half-empty club in London, she didn't need history books to tell her what she'd witnessed. She knew. She'd planted something in 1938. She'd shown the world that an electric guitar could be powerful and spiritual at once, that volume and soul weren't opposites, that a woman with a Gibson and an amplifier could change the sound of music forever. And then, 40 years later, she'd watch someone take that seed and grow it into something beautiful and strange and completely new. She'd watch the future of the instrument she'd helped create, and in that moment, watching Jimi Hendrix play blues on a Stratocaster in a small London club, Sister Rosetta Tharpe understood that some legacies don't need to be claimed. They just need to be witnessed. She never told anyone else about that night. She didn't need to. The music had said everything that mattered. And when she closed her eyes in those final years, sometimes she'd hear that sound again, that bent note hanging in the air, sustained and perfect, connecting past to future, teacher to student, the woman who started it all to the man who took it somewhere she'd never imagined it could go. That was enough. She carried that night with her quietly. When musicians complained about young players stealing their ideas, she'd smile and say nothing. When critics asked if she felt overlooked by history, she'd change the subject. The question wasn't whether people knew she'd paved the road. The question was whether the road led somewhere worth going. That night in March 1968, in a half-empty London club, she'd gotten her answer. The woman who electrified the church had watched electricity become prophecy.